Why, it's just like I signed this just yesterday.
You mentioned that in the Antietam chapter in General Lee's army is the value of momentum at that time. The Confederates felt like they couldn't be beaten, and Lee certainly rolled the iron dice of battle. Quote Johnston.
That's right.
On that presumption that they think they can't be beaten. Maybe they can't be beaten if they win this one.
That's right.
That might end it.
But you know, of course, these big battles are Lee suffering heavy casualties. He's fulfilling Jefferson Davis's strategy. Davis wants the Confederate armies to harrow the Union troops as close to the border as possible in an effort to discourage the Union from continuing to try to invade. That's his military strategy, and Lee executes it very well. But of course, the casualty losses are really high. And you mentioned before things that surprised me. The second biggest surprise, I think, was the staggering losses that Lee's army suffered. For example, if you were in the infantry in 1861 or 1862, joined the army in 61 or 62, you suffered about 80% killed, wounded at least once, killed, wounded, captured,
really,
or died of disease, or you were disabled to the point where you could no longer serve in the Confederacy.
So 8 out of 10 of those
of the
first
infantry.
2 years, infantrymen, enthusiastic,
throughout the war service.
got their name on the butcher's bill at some point.
I mean, it's just staggering. And of course, quite a few soldiers who were wounded in one battle and then killed in another, or wounded multiple times. So you just see this army sustain incredible losses over the course of time. And of course, officers, it's even worse.
Right.
So officers, I mean, I think, let me do my calculations, about 25 or 30% of all officers who ever served in Lee's army were killed in action.
Okay, yeah. Wayne, I want to look at something to illustrate something you already said. You mentioned before that part of making the military culture is that the U.S. Army didn't have accepted manuals, training manuals, or they had to create them as they went. Of course, they had traditions back to the Blue Book and of Armstrong and people like that. Currently, what you're looking at right now, the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop is featuring an exhibit of the largest collection of documents and memorabilia associated with Colonel Elmer Ellsworth in private hands. And this brings Ellsworth into our discussion. We were talking about it earlier. So Colonel Ellsworth, for his drill team, for his famous U.S. Zouaves cadets from Chicago in the 1859 and 1860, developed this amazing sort of almost Cirque du Soleil style method of training soldiers, of tactical manuals. And you mention it, Wayne, in your book. You took a look at this as well as you took at some other manuals. And tell us about the importance of the training manual to U.S. military, but also the difference of this particular guy, this Ellsworth manual, from the accepted Army manuals such as Joseph Hardee's light infantry tactics.
Yeah, this is kind of a very interesting phenomenon that occurs. If folks don't know, the Zouaves, this is taken from the French campaigns in North Africa, where the French infantry have to fight this sort of irregular bands of of Muslim North Africans. And so you actually, on the cover of my book, actually, the famous Zouave uniform with the little fez cap, the big wide pantaloons, and the sort of that tight shell jacket. This is modeled on that French, this French Orientalism that you see in the early 19th century, and it ends up migrating to the United States. Ellsworth basically takes this, there's this American fascination with this. It's sort of exotic and interesting and romantic, and it fits in with various aspects of American culture. And he takes some of the military aspects of it. But for me, the most interesting thing is the differences it has with the regular Army approach. Amongst professional Army officers, this phenomenon of what we call light infantry, infantry who fight not in that close elbow touching elbow close order that goes back to ancient times, but soldiers who are trained usually with something like a rifle to fire individually as opposed to in unison en masse, to individually take cover. This is something that begins to occur with real significance in the Napoleonic period. And the Zouaves are simply in this larger continuity of interest in light infantry tactics, which becomes more and more important as infantry weapons become more and more lethal. Ellsworth sort of half gets it. He gets, I mean, he takes this thing that's significant, but your Cirque du Soleil comment is perfect because it really becomes entertainment for him.
Right.
So he travels, he has this great northern tour where these Zouave cadets do these great exercises, but none of them are really that militarily useful, but they're great to watch.
Yeah.
Right, and the manual itself, if you examine the manual closely, what Ellsworth really just does is he takes excerpts out of the Hardy tactics, which were themselves essentially mostly a translation, to some degree an adaptation of the French Chasseurs de Pied manual. And he takes pieces out of the official Hardy tactics, but he also leaves out really important things like the importance of discipline. And when you get to the Civil War, when you see skirmishing, which is the open order, what you see is at its peak, it's this very coordinated. The soldiers, for example, although they fight individually, they're still coordinated with one another. So what's interesting is when you see comments of the veteran troops doing skirmishing, they're all on their own, but they all instinctually know how to stay in the same alignment. They don't get too far ahead of one another. They know when to stop, when to move forward, and this is part of that experience they acquire. In Ellsworth's days, it's really just a kind of an interesting, fun thing to watch, but it's not militarily useful. And this is the reason why the West Pointers are so important, is because even the best militia officers like Ellsworth don't have the real professional competence that's necessary to fight Civil War armies. And the volunteers do learn very quickly, but in 1861 they don't know what they're doing. And in all honesty, the regulars a lot of times don't really know what they're doing either.
Yeah.
But it's sort of in the world of the blind, the one-eyed man is king.
Yeah.
And that is essentially what the West Pointers are. I mean, Irwin McDowell has never had major unit command. I mean, Winfield Scott in the Mexican War, the biggest field army experience, and Scott can't take the field anymore. Scott has about 13,000 men when he captures Mexico City. McDowell's army by itself is already a multiple of that. So that's one of the challenges the armies have to deal with.
Okay. Joe, one of the problems, this again goes from General Lee's army, but one of the problems that Lee has that we don't normally associate with the Confederate Army is this terrible problem with straggling. It's another statistic that we see in General Lee's army that's borne out in soldiering in the Army of Northern Virginia. How few Confederate soldiers are actually playing the part of Confederate soldiers. How few Confederate soldiers actually are doing what Johnny Reb is reputed to do, what they did do, what those who did fight did accomplish. It's not an efficient army. There's a lot of straggling.
Yes, and Lee is always trying to crack down. Your subordinate officers are always trying to crack down. It's very difficult when they're on the march. And also keep in mind that in those days, soldiers would eat bad food. They'd be sick, diarrhea, things like that. So, it's awfully hard to march 20 miles when you have those kinds of bowel ailments or things of that nature. So the straggling's a huge factor. It's a huge factor, especially in the Maryland invasion, the first Maryland invasion,
Right.
where literally thousands and thousands of soldiers don't keep up with the army, and of course eventually many of them are gathered back in Virginia and sent back to their units.
Yep.
But Lee's army is terribly understrained at Antietam, for example.
Yeah, that's one of the real surprises I think about Antietam. Is it is true that Lee fought McClellan to a standstill against huge odds, but the reason his army was so small wasn't just because they'd all been shot by Yankees during the second NASA
Yeah, that's exactly right.
campaign. They were out looking for shoes or food or
Yeah, I mean, it's conceivable that 30% of the troops in Lee's army who were supposed to be there were not there.
yeah.
You know, had straggled. I mean, it could easily be that high.
I want to look at we've had a lot of artifacts in this show, but I think I want to look at one more because I think it speaks to both of your topics, and also it speaks to what we like to do at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. The Kaskaskia Democrat. There is a framed newspaper. So being the Kaskaskia Democrat gives it an Illinois connection that we like for Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. But the point of this particular broadside that you're looking at, the broadside was signed at the end. It was written and signed by Sidney Breese, a candidate for office in Illinois in 1831, later the governor of Illinois. And the topic is, for most of it, West Point. Sidney Breese doesn't like it. Doesn't like the idea of it. He doesn't like how it's being run. He states, I'm going to read just a little bit. There is attached to the military establishment an institution which I am in favor of abolishing altogether, or reducing it to what it was intended to be when projected by Mr. Jefferson in 1802. I mean the military academy at West Point. This was originally designed as a mere school of instruction where the junior officers should be taught their duties by their seniors and was limited to 10 cadets. The number is now 300 and maintained at a cost of more than $880,000 per annum by the government. It is a notorious fact that a large majority of those who have been educated there at the public expense, besides receiving $28 a month in pay and rations, are the sons or relatives of rich and influential men, while the son of the poor man, or the orphan child of the common soldier, made so by the fate of war, the doors are closed. He doesn't stop there. I don't have time to read the rest of it, but suffice to say, Sidney Breese, who will become governor of Illinois, so he is an influential guy, is saying something that a lot of people are saying about the U.S. Army and about West Point in 1831. It's an old boys club already. It's only for rich men's sons. And why should America have a standing army anyway in 1830? If you could respond to Governor Breese, Wayne, or if an observation of
this is very important because Americans fundamentally are historically hostile to standing armies because they see standing armies as a threat to domestic liberty. And for this, they have fairly reasonable concerns. They look at the collapse of the Roman Republic into an autocracy driven in large part by the rise of professional legions. They look at the Cromwellian usurpation of civilian power. They look at their own experience with the British, right, who they see as the Boston Massacre is seen as an example of British regulars attempting to oppress free Americans with monarchical power. So there's this profound concern that if you build a standing military establishment, which is the term they would have used, or any kind of standing army, that this will then be used by someone who's unscrupulous to then oppress domestic liberty. And therefore, one must rely on a informal militia that is, by definition, temporary.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what the Civil War armies are like. I mean, this tradition remains to this day most profoundly in things like the National Guard. Mm-hmm. West Point runs into this problem because it is the creation of a professional army. Appointments back then, as they still are done through congressional by congressmen, so that opens the place to the charge that these are well-connected boys who can go there, and to some extent that's true. They tend to be middle class. We historians have looked at that. And this is what causes a lot of political controversy. What fixes it for West Point in the antebellum period is the Mexican War. The Mexican War is a great military success, at least. So the professionalization of the army is vindicated. This then becomes another issue, though, in the early part of the Civil War. And there in the North, a lot of the problems are more political. Because West Point, the army does tend to be a conservative institution politically. It tends to be anti-emancipation. George B. McClellan is a great example of this. And also, most crucially, what happens to all the Southern-born officers? Most of them go to the Confederacy. So Northern senators are infuriated, and a lot of them see, okay, so they see, if you're a radical Republican, you see McClellan, who's clearly hostile to emancipation, and you see all these Confederates who were educated at U.S. government expense now become traitors. So they immediately say, well, West Point must be this hotbed, this snake's den of treason. And it causes even more friction between these politicians and a good chunk of the Union Army's officer corps. So this is something, it looms in the background, and it has profound effects through the entire period I cover. This one, a fear of standing armies, and also the fact that the army is a hierarchical, vaguely aristocratic, probably the most, outside of Southern slaveholders, the most aristocratic institution in the United States. And this makes good democratic Americans very, very worried.
And then even after the war, because you have politicians like John A. Logan of Illinois and Benjamin Butler, who felt that they were denied positions in the Army, or their military careers were held back because they weren't West Point graduates, and they made efforts to close West Point in the post-war period. Those, of course, failed.
Yeah, both of them, or especially Logan.
He had a legitimate
Yeah,
claim.
right, I mean,
Butler not so much.
Yeah.
There is a West Point clique, and it is built partly, nowadays Academy graduates are sometimes described as ring-knocking, right? And there is a closed, and we still have, I mean, even the Naval Academy, Naval ROTC officers sometimes have some friction with Academy grads as being kind of these princes of the Navy, right? Who sort of, who have this overinflated status of themselves. So, and there's some truth to that.